Je t'avais dit de me laisser là, Gump. Oublie-moi. Sors d'ici. Tu as entendu ce que j'ai dit?
After the production wrapped, one of those benches was handed over to the city and now sits inside the Savannah History Museum, protected behind a barrier so tourists can look but not sit. The other three have reportedly scattered into private hands over the years, becoming the kind of prop collectors quietly chase at auction. Here's a detail buried inside Forrest's cross-country running sequence that's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention to the background noise. As Forrest jogs past a small-town storefront, a television inside is playing a news report about President Jimmy Carter collapsing from heat exhaustion during a public event, a real incident that took place in September of 1979. The problem is that the film seems to place the start of Forrest's run around the middle of 1976, months before Carter had even been sworn into office. It's another example of the movie bending its own timeline to slot Forrest into a real headline, prioritizing the emotional rhythm of the montage over strict historical accuracy. Speaking of that running sequence, Tom Hanks has talked publicly about just how punishing it was to shoot. The production didn't stay in one location for the montage. Instead, the crew moved through a string of different American landscapes to capture the range of scenery audiences see as Forrest crosses the country, which meant Hanks was constantly changing locations while staying in character. He's described nearly a month of shooting days where he'd put on the costume, run for hours in a new setting, then fly out that same night to start the process over somewhere else. By the time the production got to the quieter, dialogue-heavy bench scenes, the ones that carry most of the film's narration, Hanks has said he was running on fumes. And yet those scenes were filmed in a remarkably short window, just a day and a half of shooting for some of the most quoted material in the entire movie. Hank's southern drawl became one of the most recognizable voices of the decade, but it wasn't built in a vacuum. Rather than working purely from a dialect coach, Hanks leaned on the performance of Michael Connor Humphreys, the young actor cast to play Forrest as a child. Humphreys came from Mississippi and had a natural, unforced southern accent, and Hanks studied his rhythm and cadence so the character would sound consistent whether he was 6 years old or fully grown. It's a small piece of collaboration that a lot of viewers never think about, but it's part of why the character feels like one continuous person across decades of story. One of the more famous business decisions connected to this film has nothing to do with acting at all. Rather than take a large flat salary, Hanks negotiated a deal that gave him a cut of the film's profits instead. At the time, that wasn't an obviously smart move. Nobody, including the studio, was fully certain the film would become the cultural phenomenon it turned into. When Forrest Gump exploded at the box office, that profit-sharing arrangement turned into one of the more famous paydays in Hollywood history, reportedly earning Hanks far more than a traditional salary ever could have. Bubba, Forrest's friend and shrimping partner from his army days, is remembered almost as much for his appearance as for his dialogue, and that signature look, especially his heavy lower lip, was built using a prosthetic piece rather than anything natural to actor Michael T. Williamson. The prosthetic had to be shaped carefully enough that it moved naturally with his mouth during dialogue, since anything stiff or obviously fake would have pulled focus in every scene he appeared in. It worked well enough that plenty of viewers assumed it was simply how the actor looked. The shrimping business Bubba dreams about eventually spilled off the screen and into the real world. After the movie became a hit, a seafood restaurant chain themed around the story launched, opening its first location in Monterey, California, and slowly expanding into a global brand filled with movie memorabilia and shrimp-focused menus. In one of the order footnotes tied to that chain, a future movie star reportedly worked at one of its Hawaii locations years before landing his first major acting break, discovered in part because of how naturally charismatic he was while working the floor. The Vietnam War sequences looked convincingly like Southeast Asia, but they were actually shot along the South Carolina coastline, using island locations that had to be dressed up with imported foliage to sell the illusion of a dense, humid jungle. Visual effects work extended that illusion even further, layering in additional greenery digitally so the terrain felt thicker and more oppressive than the natural coastal landscape alone could provide. It's one of the better examples in the film of production design and digital work meeting in the middle to fake a location convincingly. The film also drops Forrest into the University of Alabama during one of the defining clashes of the Civil Rights era, when the governor at the time physically blocked the schoolhouse door to try to stop 2 black students from enrolling. That standoff was real, and it ended only after federal officials intervened on behalf of the students, backed by the authority of the president. The film uses Forrest as a quiet witness to this moment rather than a participant, letting a piece of genuine, difficult history sit inside the story without turning it into comedy. The Vietnam sequences went through a notable rewrite before filming began. Earlier drafts of the script reportedly leaned into a real but uncomfortable piece of military history: the practice of grouping soldiers with lower cognitive test scores into the same units during the war. The final version narrowed that idea down so that only Forrest and Bubba represented their population, while the rest of their platoon was portrayed as an ordinary mix of soldiers. Despite the softened approach, military historians have since pointed out that several details in the finished war scenes, like the ambush tactics used against the platoon and the way soldiers describe marching under brutal conditions, actually align with real accounts from the era, even if the film's tone stays lighter than the war itself ever was. One of the quieter, more personal touches in the film involves two children who appear only briefly. When young Forrest boards the school bus for the first time and gets turned away by two kids before Jenny offers him a seat, those two rejecting children were played by the real-life son of the director and the real-life daughter of Tom Hanks. It's a blink-and-you-miss-it detail, but it adds a strange bit of behind-the-scenes intimacy to one of the film's most important character introductions, the moment that begins Forrest and Jenny's lifelong bond. Casting on this film could have gone in wildly different directions. Several major actors reportedly turned down the title role before it landed with Hanks, and at least one of them has spoken publicly about regretting the decision years later. The role of Bubba also passed through a handful of other performers before settling on Williamson, and the part of Jenny had its own list of well-known actresses considered before Robin Wright took the role and earned award nominations for it. Even Lieutenant Dan almost went to a different actor before Gary Sinise ended up defining the character for good. Funding that famous cross-country run almost didn't happen at all. According to Hanks, the studio balked at the cost of shooting such a sprawling, multi-location sequence, and rather than lose it from the film, Hanks and the director agreed to personally help cover part of the expense in exchange for a bigger stake in the film's earnings. It's a rare case of the film's most visually simple sequence, just a man running, being one of its most expensive and financially complicated to get made. The feather that opens and closes the film feels like it must be a piece of digital trickery, drifting and swirling with too much grace to be real. It isn't computer-generated at all. The crew filmed an actual feather against a blue screen across many separate takes, then stitched the best moments together to create one continuous, flowing path through the air. That blend of practical filming and careful editing gives the feather a texture and unpredictability that fully synthetic animation from that era would have struggled to match. During the football scenes, Hanks was reportedly dealing with a genuine illness while performing physically demanding sequences that required him to sprint the length of a field again and again. It's a small, almost trivial piece of production history, but it's a reminder that a lot of what looks effortless on screen involved actors pushing through discomfort that never makes it into the final cut. There was, for a period, real interest in continuing Forrest's story beyond the original film, loosely based on a follow-up novel written after the movie's success. The idea reportedly leaned into a stranger, more self-aware direction, with Forrest reacting to the existence of a movie made about his own life and pointing out where it got things wrong. That version of the story never made it past early development, and today it exists mostly as an interesting footnote rather than anything audiences ever got to see. And one of the most quoted lines in the entire film wasn't even written into the script. The now famous introduction, where Forrest tells a stranger his name and then repeats it right back to them, was reportedly something Hanks added in the moment while filming, rather than dialogue that existed on the page beforehand. It stuck immediately, became one of the most recognized lines associated with the character, and is a good example of how a small improvised choice can end up defining an entire performance. Now here's the blooper we promised at the start, the one hiding in plain sight for anyone who's ever paused on that gravesite scene. Late in the film, Forrest visits Jenny's headstone and speaks to her the way he always spoke to her in life, gently and without pretense. At one point he tells her she died on a Saturday morning. It's a small, tender line, easy to accept without a second thought. But the date carved into the headstone right behind him doesn't actually fall on a Saturday at all. If you check a calendar for that exact date, it lands on a Monday. It's the kind of mistake that requires almost nobody to notice, because it's not visual in the way a missing prop or shifting shadow would be. It's buried in a single spoken line next to a background detail most viewers aren't cross-referencing while they're wiping away tears. And that's really the charm of it. A film this beloved, watched and rewatched for decades, still is a quiet little inconsistency sitting right there in one of its most emotional scenes, waiting for someone to actually do the math. Of course, that's 5 from the only inconsistency hiding inside this film if you go looking for it. Eagle-eyed viewers have pointed out a background extra who somehow appears twice in the same shot during the anti-war rally at the reflecting pool, simply because the same footage was reused from 2 different angles without anyone catching the repeat.